This afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas contained in this letter of October 20th. And after that, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of development theory that existed outside of the Baha'i faith over the period of the last 20, 30, 40 years here in the Western world. Dwight is going to talk after that, and then we're going to break for our refreshments. After that, we're going to come back and we're going to break into discussion groups that will focus on the material contained within the letter of October 20th. And tonight we'll continue the discussion, both of us, about social and economic development projects and focus a bit more on Africa and some of the things that are going on in Africa. I thought to begin with, I would give you some of the comments of Dr. Peter Kahn, who spoke to us on behalf of the International Teaching Center at the Auxiliary Board Conference in Lincolnwood in May. And he spent an afternoon speaking about the social and economic development ideas that were inherent in the letter and that the International Teaching Center had discussed. And I wanted to bring to you some of the background thinking that he told us about and one of the quotations that he read to us and referred us to. And by the way, when I was in Southern Africa, Councillor Hooper Dunbar was making a similar kind of trip to Councillor Peter Kahn's here in the United States. And he reiterated many of the things that Councillor Kahn told us when he was here in the United States and added some ideas which he felt were particularly relevant to the African situation. Now, Peter Kahn said that there were three fundamental principles underlying this letter. The first being that you cannot segregate the human heart from the outside environment. He had a quotation which came from a letter of Shoghi Effendi's, which he said was as yet unpublished, but Mr. Dunbar alluded to the fact that there will be a compilation coming out soon on quotations which are relevant to these development issues, and that this would be included for us at this time. But the principle that you cannot segregate the human heart from the outside environment, that here we're involved again with the organic analogy of unity in the Baha'i faith. It makes a great deal of sense to us once it's stated and we begin to think about it, that there are all sorts of mutual actions and reactions from the inner life and the outer environment which interact on each other all the time. And we were talking last night about Maslow's ladder of human needs. Of course, there's the need to have food, and that is a basic need, one of those basic biological needs to keep from starving. But we can't isolate that from all of the other needs that we have of safety, interpersonal relationships, and relationship to a creator, and so on and so forth. Food is basic. Food keeps us from starving, but food isn't the only thing. And we have to realize that there are these mutual reactions and interactions both ways. In the same way, we can't just live on faith alone. We do have to have some material food and shelter to sustain us too. The second fundamental principle underlying this letter refers to Baha'i worship itself. And there is a quotation in Bahá'í Administration which both of the counselors referred us to, which was written by Shoghi Effendi in 1929. It's in a section on a letter talking about the purpose of the Mashri'ql-Adhkár and what the worship services would be like in the Mashri'ql-Adhkár and what this would be like in the future. If you want page references, it's Bahá'í Administration. This section was page 184 to 187. I'm going to read you just a small section from page 185 and 186. Now, you know, Shoghi Effendi's sentences are sometimes long, so I'll try to stop and go back over some key points here so that you won't get lost. Now, he's talking about the fact that worship service is not just going to be an eclectic kind of situation where people are going to be coming in from different religions and creating different kinds of services, but there's going to be a special kind of Baha'i service that's developed. And then he goes on to say But however inspiring the conception of Baha'i worship as witnessed in the central edifice of this exalted temple, it cannot be regarded as the sole nor even the essential factor in the part which the Mashriqu'l-Adhkár, as designed by Baha'u'llah, is destined to play in the organic life of the Baha'i community. So Baha'i worship is not going to be the sole, or even the essential factor that the part the Mashriqu'l-Adhkár will play in the Baha'i community. Now here's the key point. Divorced from the social, humanitarian, educational, and scientific pursuits centering around the dependencies of the Mashriqu'l-Adhkár, Baha'i worship, however exalted in its conception, however passionate in fervor, can never hope to achieve beyond the meager and often transitory results produced by the contemplation of the ascetic or the communion of the passive worshiper. Shall I go over that sentence again? We can't sit around and just worship. Divorced from the social, humanitarian, educational, and scientific pursuits centering around the dependencies of the Mashriqu'l-Adhkár, Baha'i worship, however exalted in its conception, however passionate in its fervor, can never hope to achieve beyond the meager and often transitory results produced by the contemplations of the ascetic or the communion of the passive worshiper. It being Baha'i worship, cannot afford lasting satisfaction and benefit to the worshiper himself, much less to humanity in general, unless and until translated and transfused into that dynamic and disinterested service to the cause of humanity, which it is the supreme privilege of the dependencies of the Mashriqu'l-Adhkár to facilitate and promote. This quotation was circulated by both Councillor Peter Kahn and by Councillor Hooper Dunbar in their travels. And sometimes they would paraphrase it by saying that, referring to Baha'i worship, they kind of compressed this longer sentence of the Guardian and said it this way, that Baha'i worship cannot afford lasting satisfaction to the worshiper himself unless translated and transfused into dynamic and disinterested service to the cause of humanity. Otherwise, it is limited and transitory. That's taking a few key phrases and trying to put it together in some sort of a nugget. But, of course, they warned we're not going into a kind of a warmed-over social work kind of situation either. We're not going to be these do-gooders who are going around putting Band-Aids on the old world order. And that brings us to the third fundamental principle underlying this message, that our work, this work, the work of the faith, is the total reconstruction of society, building a new race of man. You can pull these phrases out of many, many different kinds of Baha'i quotations, so I'm not going to give you page and reference to one or two. This is what we're about. You know, we're spreading the word of God, but we're building a new world order. We're building a new kind of Baha'i community. And our thoughts must be centered on this total kind of building that we're doing, not just teaching about Baha'u'llah and stopping at that point, but the total reconstruction of the world and an ever-advancing civilization. Now, Councillor Peter Kahn also pointed out that as soon as this letter came out, the House of Justice began to receive many, many letters from Baha'is all over the world responding to this, responding to one part or another. Very often with proposals that were very large, very top-heavy, involving a lot of funds and involving a lot of direction from dominant countries into third world countries or developing countries. And he pointed out that in the letter of October 20th, in the third paragraph, the last paragraph of the first page, something that most people who had written letters to the Universal House of Justice with these proposals had missed. And by the way, he said that the response to these proposals was no, no, 1,000 times no. This is not what we're doing. You haven't read the letter, go back and read the letter. But he pointed out that the October 20th letter in this third paragraph said that this process of social and economic regeneration must begin within the Baha'i community itself. We must begin to look at ourselves first and get our own house in order before we go out and change the world. And it was to begin with 3 steps. And this is pointed out in that paragraph. Our learning how to apply spiritual principles, the application of spiritual principles, a rectitude of conduct, distinguishing ourselves with this rectitude of conduct, and learning how to practice the art of consultation. I'm sure that every Baha'i community in the world needs to practice and begin to apply these kinds of principles. The Baha'i community itself must lift itself up and become self-sufficient and self-reliant. This is all contained in that letter. But very often the friends read quickly and skip certain paragraphs and go on to catchy phrases that they themselves are interested in and go way beyond the point of the letter at that time. He urged that we should get this letter out and study it over and over and over and over again. And that's what we'll be doing in our study class this afternoon. He gave us an example of a very good kind of project which the House of Justice had noticed, because there were a lot of questions about what kinds of projects do you think there should be and what can we do. And for one thing, he mentioned that perhaps the projects in the Western world would be more social and less economic. And tonight I'll go over a few of the ideas that he had. But he did caution against big top-down kinds of projects, colonial kinds of projects, projects that smacked of paternalism between the haves and the have-nots. And also projects which distracted us from teaching. He talked about the fact that much of the aid which had gone into many of the developing countries had come to naught. In fact, to use his phraseology, he said the third world is littered with burned-out tractors. So we're trying to stay away from this kind of approach to the social and economic development projects. But he did give us a wonderful example of a project that had happened in Zaire in an area with the Pygmies. Now, the Pygmies are nomadic peoples, traditionally nomadic, who are hunters and gatherers. And to make this, I'm going to collapse his story a bit, but they usually move around through the forest, scavenging for food, and sometimes become beggars around the more settled villages of other peoples. Now, this Pygmy group, imbued with the idea of how they could really develop themselves and help themselves, had now settled down and had built a village, a stable village for themselves, and had actually begun to grow crops in a stable situation and have some sort of animals that they were herding. And so then they left their nomadic way of life and they had settled down, were practicing agriculture, and they decided that they should learn something. So they also asked for some help in learning ABCs and their numbers, 1 to 100. And they began to go to tutorial schools and learn these kinds of things. And a community development officer, who was not a Baha'i, came out to this village to see what was going on with this Pygmy village. And he saw this, and they all lined up in front of him and recited their ABCs and their numbers from 1 to 100 as an evidence of what they had done for themselves and pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. And he was so impressed by this that he began to study the Baha'i faith and became a Baha'i. But the House of Justice said that this was a very good kind of development because it was awakening the developmental sense in the people themselves. And they themselves were deciding what they wanted to do and guiding their own destiny with outside help from those who were able to offer some small assistance. Now, When I was in Africa and Councillor Dunbar was there, he spoke for a weekend session with auxiliary board members in Southern Africa, and I was invited to come. And one of the points he stressed was that when you get into these social and economic development projects, and his comments were keyed by a question of one auxiliary board member who really did have a very different kind of idea that now the aid is coming kind of thing. You know, now we're going to get some sort of assistance. And he wanted to straighten this out. And he said, now, this is not going to be that kind of aid where you just all of a sudden drop in aid. Now the aid is coming. But it's going to be where you find a self-help kind of assistance, where you find these strong local Baha'i communities, a strong nucleus that's been built in the village itself, and where you can move with some self-sufficiency into a project to help better yourselves or better your community with local labor and, to a great extent, local funds and local enthusiasm. Now, this is very different than the normal kind of aid drop where you say, okay, now I need a well, and somebody comes in and does something for you or gives you a well or gives you a tractor. It must have the component of people doing things for themselves. And in this, I think you can see that we can much better find ourselves in a position where these people who have developed to self-sufficiency and self-reliancy will have a certain kind of respect and dignity for themselves and will have built their own confidence level to a greater degree than if we just had some aid drop because we happen to have a lot of money. Now, Councillor Dunbar again went over this paradigm which was contained in the quotation from Bahá'í Administration. That is, that there is the central edifice, the Mashri'ql-Adhkár, the spiritual heart, and from that the dependencies come next. In the same way, the spiritual precedes the material, and there develops the strong spiritual local community, and out of that then develops the material aid projects, because they are then able and capable of moving out into the world with their strong spiritual, enthusiastic, unified foundation and moving out and working into some of the aid projects. He also quoted the same letter of October 29th, October of 1929, about not being able to segregate the human heart from the outside environment, and said it's very important that we see how these two work together and that we recognize this. Since I'm talking about Councillor Dunbar, he also spoke one evening for all of the Baha'is in Harare in Zimbabwe, and he told us two really kind of interesting stories, so I'll digress just a little bit from social and economic development projects because you might be interested in hearing these. He had been making this similar kind of trip through Africa that Councillor Peter Kahn had here, and he had been in Zaire. Now, he'd been there for a 2-day meeting, and he took quite a long time telling us about this fantastic meeting, which was probably the most impressive event of his stay in Africa. And he said that he was taken out to this rural area, and he found that this village, which did have a very strong Baha'i community, had built their own center. In fact, they had planted a crop of some sort of crop. I don't know what kind that was, but a special crop that the Baha'i community had planted to earn money so that they could put a roof on the center. And then they decided, well, maybe we'll have guests coming out, or maybe somebody will come and visit us, a visitor. So they said, we'll build a 4-room guest house. So they built this 4-room guest house also. So when he got out there, well, he was taken to this guest house, and they said, well, maybe you'd like to rest, lie down and rest. You've had a long trip out, and the meeting will begin later on in the afternoon. So he went in and rested, and he kept hearing all these strange noises outside. You know, a lot of people making quite a lot of noise. So when he got up after a couple of hours and went outside, he found that 300 people had arrived for the meeting. And also, they had built a nice shelter. Of course, the people couldn't get into the Baha'i Center. It was too small. But they had built some sort of shelter with leaves and a roof so that there was this open-air shelter for them to have the meeting in. So 300 people had arrived. But later, someone came up to him and said, oh, we just heard that 700 more are on their way. And he had, it was really quite interesting because he said all of this was told to him by the local committee on statistics, which had, and they kept tab on everybody who came, and they'd say how many auxiliary board members were there and how many LSAs were represented, and give him all of the statistical information. So he said that there was one man that really had walked for 10 days to get to this meeting, and one woman who was 75 years old who had walked 300 kilometers to get to this meeting. I'm collapsing his story, too, because it took about 20 minutes to tell all the details of this fantastic meeting. He said after a while, another 300, they heard another 300 were coming over the hills, and, they'd hear some noise, and some more people would come. And finally, in all, they had about 1,800 people there for the meeting. And a lot of board members, a lot of assistants, 156 LSAs were represented, and several choirs, because a lot of the communities had their own choirs. And he said at different times during this 2-day meeting, if things got a little rough or things got a little noisy, there were some old ladies that kind of acted as disciplinarians. And the old ladies would step out and shake around and shake their fingers at people and tell them to be quiet, or else they'd get a choir up and get them to sing some song. In the meantime, why they decided that they needed to collect some money, so they'd put some big wash tubs with towels very discreetly draped over them, and people kept coming up distributing their money into the wash tubs, and they get higher and higher until the committee on local committee on finances would take the tub aside and begin to count the money, and they'd put another tub there. And they had a lot of different kinds of songs that they sang about many different topics in the faith. That was one of their prime ways of teaching. They had songs about the 7-year plan, or about Mirza Midi, about the Tablet of Ahmad. And also there was a great emphasis on memorization of prayers. One woman recited 30 prayers that she knew by heart. Anyway, this was quite a wonderful meeting that went on for these 2 days. And obviously it impressed him, and it left all of us gasping down there too, because we'd never seen anything quite like that in southern Africa. And we all wanted to know how this was done, because it just connoted such an activity, a level of activity on the part of the local believers that most of us don't see out in the pioneering field, and we wanted to know how it had been done. Well, those questions came right after he finished. They said, okay, why is this going on here? He said these were a really very fiery and enthusiastic kind of people, but that they had been persecuted as Baha'is for several years, and now the persecution had been kind of lifted from them, and so he felt that they were very active. But he said he himself didn't know what the answer was as to why they were so active. The other story he told was an answer to a question of how is the temple in India coming, and he said that 2 pedals are now completed, and this is all being built by hand labor, and it's the first building that's been built in India like this with all this hand labor for 50 years. He said most of the workers are women on the project, and he said that sometimes the temperature gets to be 50 to 52 Celsius. I figured that out on my calculator, and it comes to 122 to 125 Fahrenheit, which seems very hot, but he must be quite correct, because he said this presented a problem in pouring the cement, and they had to have special kinds of places where they could keep the cement cool before they took it out and poured the cement, because it was so hot to work out there. He said the overseer went to Britain, and he was a bit worried when he went. He was going to be gone for some weeks, that the quality would kind of go down and that mistakes would be made. But the inspector and the architect went out to observe what was going on, and they said that everything was just working very smoothly, and everything was on time, and was proceeding quite well. The mayor of New Delhi had visited the site and had stayed for a couple of hours looking around at the temple, and he wrote in the visitor's book, "This has been a spiritual pilgrimage, and the building is not yet finished. Imagine what it will be like when it is finished." So those are just a couple of stories that he shared with us, and I thought you'd be interested in hearing about that. Now, just to put development, the whole area of development, into perspective, let's look at the outside world and what kind of development has been going on over the last Well, actually, since the end of World War II, when we began to get into what we call the development field. Now, there was a dominant paradigm or model which was used all during the 50s and 60s and up into the 70s that had to do with, to a very great extent, with quantitative or materialistic kinds of measures. I'm going to read a bit from Everett Rogers, who is a writer in communication and development, as he explains what the idea was from this dominant model of development, which grew up after World War II and which influenced developmental thinking. Through the late 1960s, a dominant paradigm ruled intellectual definitions and discussions of development and guided national development programs. This concept of development grew out of certain historical events, such as the Industrial Revolution in Europe and the United States, the colonial experience in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, the quantitative empiricism of North American social science, and capitalistic economic political philosophy. Implicit in the ruling paradigm were numerous assumptions which were generally thought to be valid or at least not widely questioned till into the 1970s. Definitions of development centered around the criterion of the rate of economic growth. The level of national development at any given point in time was the gross national product. Gross national product. That was the aggregate of everything that was made in the country. And when divided by the total population of the nation, it became per capita income. Although there was a certain amount of intellectual discomfort with per capita income as the main index of development, especially among non-economists, alternative measures and definitions of development had relatively few proponents. So we had this view that development was to increase somehow gross national product in a certain country, and it was the theory at that time, which was called the trickle-down theory, that if we increase this gross national product, that everybody in the country would somehow benefit from this, both the people who were wealthy and the people who were poor. It was a little too sophisticated at that time to begin to think about whether that was happening or not. We just kind of naively assumed that if we increased the size of this pie, everybody got a little bit bigger slice. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, as we're going to see. Now, when we got to the 1970s, a lot of the development writing began to focus on the equality of distribution. And we found, lo and behold, that this had not happened. Unfortunately, the rich had got richer and the poor had got poorer. And we hadn't done very much to help the rural poor at all and develop the rural areas. There had been little or no change. Sometimes the change was for the worse, depending upon population densities. Now, implicit in this model that I was talking about, the early model, which we'll call Western model, top-down model, trickle-down model, whatever you want to call it, there was a kind of intellectual ethnocentrism. We believed that everybody wanted to be kind of like us in the 1950s. You know, we were kind of bumptious and enthusiastic and riding on the post-war booms. And we believed that everybody all over the world would love to have an economy just like us. Well, that was not necessarily so. But we felt that this was the way nations should advance. And so we analyzed everything that happened on this basis, that the nation should be advancing towards us. Let's just take nation X in the third world or developing world. If it was not advancing in its economy and society, not advancing towards what we were doing and what our standards were, then what were the stumbling blocks? And then we always looked internally to find out what was keeping that nation from developing and becoming a carbon copy of what the Western world was like. Now, we never looked at the external causes. We never looked at what we as a capitalistic nation or the multinational corporations were doing to the underdeveloped countries. we only looked at these internal kinds of causes, the traditional cultures, the peasants being pessimistic or fatalistic. No. The economic systems being different, and why didn't they change and become more in conformity with ours, or the political systems? We wanted to change things so that they modeled us. Again, in the 70s, we began to redefine these causes of underdevelopment and look at the outside constraints, the external world constraints for development, as well as these internal stumbling blocks. We began to look at the international terms of trade that big nations imposed upon small nations. We began to look at the economic imperialism of big multinational corporations where there was so much control. We began to look at the vulnerability and dependability of these small nations on different kinds of aid programs and what these were in fact doing to the countries. Also in the 70s, we began to develop new approaches and get new ideas. The Small is Beautiful book came out with Schumacher. And we began to think about intermediate technology or small technology, whereas before we just thought of this stuff as second rate, you know. And if we wanted to be really nice developers, we wanted to give them a big tractor that came from here because that was the best we could provide. Now, as we looked at Small is Beautiful, we thought maybe, you know, it's not so good to give them the big tractor. Remember, as Peter Kahn said, the third world is littered with burned-out tractors. But to give them something that will keep on running and not burn out quite so quickly. We also looked at some of the problems that we were having as far as ecology and environment were concerned, some of the pollution problems. And we began to question, too, whether our models were exactly the right models to have everybody try to emulate. So we began to question what we were doing ourselves. During the world oil crisis, this showed us very clearly in bringing many of the developed nations kind of to their knees that small nations or developing nations could somehow become very rich overnight and could become major forces in the world economy. And it didn't take necessarily a long time for this kind of phenomenon to happen. At the same time, we saw the opening of China, and we began to learn a lot about China. And we looked at some of their programs where they had modernized health services, education services, and they had not asked for or taken any kind of outside aid. And the technology or the resources used in development were very different from the old Western top-down kinds of models that we were talking about. Also, Cuba and Tanzania and Chile also had learning experiences for us to look at some of their projects that had gone on and to learn from these different techniques and alternatives to the monolithic kind of development plans that we had once focused on. And lastly, we just saw that development wasn't going too well. We hadn't done too much. We'd had 20 years of development work, and we really hadn't accomplished a lot of the objectives that we had set out to do. So it just wasn't working too well. I can give you some examples of working on a development projects or going in to work on proposals for development projects where people never really got out into the rural area and looked around to find out what was going on in the rural area. Ben Glamini and I were just talking about this at lunchtime. That when I was there in Swaziland one time, I happened to have a car because I was pioneering in Lesotho at that time. And so I suggested to the rest of my team that was writing this proposal, well, let's go out and look at this rural development area. Let's get in the car and go out and look at it. And they said, yeah, what? Can we do that? And most time, if you're from the World Bank or AID or you're from one of the development groups, CETA, whatever it is coming in, you go to the capital, you sit down around a table, you work in your AID office or your UN office. You work by interviewing the ministers or the permanent secretaries of the country that you're in, but you never get out and talk to the people. You never get out and talk to the woman who's going to be affected when they say, okay, let's move all the houses into the village, and so we're going to scrape your land, and you have to move your house over here. They never get out and talk to somebody like that and find out how that's going to affect their life or their fortunes or what's going to happen, whether it's going to make them destitute or not. So I think there's a great deal more of that realization that this thing was kind of sterile to begin with, and the aid projects were made without looking really at people and what happened to the people. Now, the new elements that have been inculcated into the newer models of development sound much more close to our Baha'i concepts. And it's nice to know that the outside world is catching up with us. And we feel a lot more comfortable maybe working in development at this period in time than we did 20 or 30 years ago. Because some of the main elements have to do with this focus on equality of chance of distribution of goods, and the fact that if you just are creating a system where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, that's not really development. But the focus should be on the poor or the rural areas and how they can have priority to close this gap. The second element would be popular participation in self-development, planning, and execution. Here's the grassroots approach coming in again that's been mentioned in our October 20th letter. And a knowledge that people cannot be developed, but people have to develop themselves. It can't be something that you do to people, but it has to be something that people are encouraged to do for themselves. Self-reliance and independence. I've got to go over these real quickly because Dwight's going to be pushing me off the podium here. That it's possible to integrate the traditional with the modern, that you don't have to scrape away the whole traditional system and then just put in some sort of Western model of politics or economic system or social system, but there can be some sort of synchronization of the old and the new ideas. And boy, I'll tell you, in the old projects, very often it was the anthropologist was the only one that raised his or her lonely voice to say, hey, boy, you don't know what you're going to be doing to these people if you put through this project. They just did not realize some of the implications of what was going to happen. There's been a lot of redefinition of what is development, and it's a much more humanistic, a much more Baha'i approach. Let me read this paragraph and close with this. What is development? Out of the various criticisms of the dominant paradigm of development grew a questioning of the concept of development, from one that had centered on the materialistic economic growth to a definition that implied such other valued ends as social advancement, equality, and freedom. These valued qualities should be determined by the people themselves through a widely participatory process. Thus, each nation might pursue a somewhat different pathway to development, depending on exactly what style of development was desired. We summarize these newer conceptions of development by defining development as a widely participatory process of social change in society intended to bring about both social and material advancement, including greater equality, freedom, and other valued qualities for the majority of the people through their gaining greater control over their environment. And Rogers footnoted, and in kind of a tongue-in-cheek fashion, he said, please note how this has changed from my old definition of years ago, when he had this definition. Development is a type of social change in which new ideas are introduced into a social system. Note how different that is. In order to produce higher per capita incomes and levels of living through more modern production methods and improved social organization. So just in a span of a few years, he's changed his definition from one to the other. Now, this evening, I want to talk about the fact that many Christian groups and many other social action groups are recognizing the need for this kind of change too, and to read you a few quotations from a Catholic bishop in Tanzania, and then show you some development materials which I picked up in Zimbabwe, which were made by Christian groups, social action groups, and a lot of other groups that are getting into literacy training and the fields of social and economic development, and then tell you a little bit about some of the Baha'i projects that are going on in Africa, too. There are a lot of religious groups that are interested in becoming involved in social transaction as we are. And it was very interesting being in Zimbabwe this last 6 weeks because as an avowed socialist country, it has a lot of resources which are not available to us here in the West. We located 4 or 5 really interesting bookstores, one of which is called the Grassroots Bookstore, as a matter of fact. We didn't tell them about the October 20th message, but one of the first sets of books I picked up was called Training for Transformation, a handbook for community workers. And it's 2 women who are in a Christian organization who have worked up these 3 workbooks. And on the back it says, Training for Transformation provides a basic and comprehensive text for adult education workers, social workers, community development workers, church workers, and trade union educators, and all concerned with the process of transforming society. I think that includes us, too. Now, they said Training for Transformation integrates the approach of Paulo Freire and how to put this method into practice. And he was one of the great educators who has worked long and hard, particularly in the Latin American countries, and dealt a lot with how to raise the consciousness of people and how to get them involved in activity. Group methods which are essential for participatory education. Organizational development which stresses how to build structures which enable people to become self-reliant. And social analysis to help groups find the root causes of their problems. Now, they go through 3 volumes of little tips and techniques. A comprehensive theory runs through these 3 books on how you work out the problems and approach these problems and get people involved. And I'll just tell you the first few steps that they're suggesting, and then you can kind of take it from there and figure out what they're doing. First of all, they have a basic assumption that they present that there's 2 different kinds of approaches as far as education is concerned, and this goes along with the work of Paulo Freire. He says there are 2 different kinds of approach in education. One is the banking approach. That's where the student sits right here and the teacher fills his head like he's filling a gas station. Actually, that's what we're doing with you tonight, but unfortunately, I like to take the other approach, but we don't have the time. This afternoon we did the other approach. Okay, the banking approach, the teacher is seen as possessing all the essential information. The pupils are seen as empty vessels needing to be filled with knowledge. The teacher talks, the pupils absorb passively. Now, the other kind of approach to education is the problem-posing approach, where the animator provides a framework for thinking, creative, active participants to consider a common problem and find the solutions. The animator raises questions, why, how, and who. The participants are active, describing, analyzing, suggesting, deciding, and planning. And boy, we would certainly like to have Baha'i communities like that when we go out to teach, whether we're pioneers, whether we're here in local communities or whatever. We'd like to see this kind of thing go on. Now, they give some examples of how to begin to get people involved in the discussions. And they gave a very interesting example of how they would present 2 skits to the community and begin a discussion of different methods of approaching problems in the community. And in one skit, they have a community development officer going out and standing in the front of the room and kind of directing the conversation and not listening to the people's responses very much, but obviously he has his own preconceived ideas of what community development is going to happen, and he's just there kind of to enlist their support and actually direct their support at the end. The second skit is, of course, a much more participatory kind of community development officer who goes out, encourages people to talk, and one of them suggests a football field and the other suggests a clinic, and they come to some conclusion and actually 3 people in the group want the football field, and one person goes along with that, so they decide to have that. Now, one of the authors says, actually, this set of skits came from a real-life experience that she had. This exercise was developed from a real-life experience in Uganda in 1959. A village had numerous problems in both the health field, all types of worms, malaria, bilharzia, no clinic, and a very poor school from which the teachers were nearly always absent. In a village meeting, the people really did insist that their top priority was to make a football field. I was appalled, but the CDO, the Community Development Officer, very wisely encouraged the group to go ahead. They made their football field, started playing football, organized a team, played matches against other villages. The football field was a turning point in the life of the village. They had gained self-confidence, a structure for communicating with one another, and a sense that they were capable of changing things. Later, they tackled many other more important projects. But were they really more important? Was not their own intuition that they needed something that would build their own sense of themselves as a community and their confidence that they could achieve their own goals far more important than my outsider priority that they needed a clinic? This was also a turning point in my own education about how to work with communities. Later, I heard many other stories of how football fields had helped deal with serious problems of teenage drinking. So we can go on, and this book has a lot of illustrations, lots of suggestions for going through the different kinds of steps to get people involved in action planning. They suggest very strongly the use of codes, that is, some sort of audiovisual material or some sort of skit to get people involved in talking about their problems. And they'll present, let's say it's a picture of someone who's a woman who's poor and doesn't have some sort of resources that she wants to have. And they'll get the group talking about this, and then they'll say, now, is this a real-life kind of situation after they determine what it is that's going on in the code? Is this a real-life situation here? Are there any problems like this here? Now, very soon they'll find out if there are, if this is a real problem in that area, or if it's not a real problem. And also continue the conversation and the discussion and find out what related problems there are and what are the root causes of these problems. And then move on to the action planning and the evaluation of this. Now, this is very different from the community development officer coming out and saying, you have a problem with worms, you better all go to the clinic. It's a very different kind of approach. One of the approaches that Dr. David Werner lists in Where There Is No Doctor, he calls his method of involvement the but why method. The child has a septic foot, but why? Because she stepped on a thorn, but why? Because she has no shoes. But why has she no shoes? Because her father cannot afford to buy her any. And it's so on and so forth, so that you begin to get people to think about what are the underlying causes behind whatever problems that they happen to be tackling in their community. So first we have some sort of descriptive material that's presented or somehow given to the group, an analysis of what this is, a determination of whether these kinds of things are problems in real life in their community or not, and what are some of the related problems, and some of the root causes and action planning. Now, of course, you can realize very readily and very quickly that this can lead into social revolution. And that's what a lot of this kind of social action planning does lead to. I mean, that's what it was intended to lead to, overthrow of governments and things like that, which obviously we don't want to get into. So we have to stop before we overthrow the government and try to work some other way than that. That's a terrific series. Any Baha'i could get loads and loads of ideas from that series of development transformation. There are even problems about how to deal with family problems in the community and how to consult, how to build confidence in the groups that are coming together to discuss these kinds of problems, and just lots of wonderful tips for Baha'is. Now, this other series that I picked out is called Learn and Teach. This comes from South Africa. It has to do with literacy, and that's its main aim, because it has the words in large type that helps people learn to read. But as Paulo Freire said, teaching an adult to read is not the same as teaching a child to read. You don't start in the same way, and you don't proceed in the same way. You begin much more when you teach an adult to read, to teach them things that are very meaningful and that will keep them really interested in learning to read. So first of all, here's an article about electricity, and an area was electrified, and how to read your electricity meter, how much you can estimate that it may cost you, so that you'll know how much electricity will add to your total bill, or how many hours you can keep on a light before it adds more money to your total bill. So these are learning kinds of things that people can use in their everyday life. There's an article about working with a drill for the road and some of the problems, health problems that men face when they're working with these drills in the road, and what health signs to look out for and what to do if these things occur. There's an article about unrest in schools and how kids are receiving unfair punishment by teachers in the schools in South Africa. They must love this in South Africa. And here's a poster for kids to hang up in their school called Punishment, Your Rights at School. And it goes through and tells them exactly how they can be punished at school and how they can't, and what line the teacher can't step over, so that kids will know what their rights are at school and actually suggest to them to post it at school. For instance, the headmaster cannot hit the student more than 4 times in one day. And that's true. The headmaster must not use a stick. Must use a stick not longer than 75 centimeters and not thicker than 1.2 centimeters. What's the law in Swaziland, Ben? Got one there? About the same. Okay. Now, there are articles about Lesotho and the people who are waiting for jobs there in Lesotho. And the last section has to do with sending money by post, learning how to use postal orders, what they look like, where to fill in what, and money orders, what to expect, how to fill it in again, and then registered mail. It's all geared for sending money through mail, which there's a lot of in Southern Africa because there's so much migrant labor in and out to South Africa and back again. And it ends up with some cartoons, some fun cartoons, and fun things to read too. Okay, that's a series published in South Africa, but widely used all over Southern Africa. Now, we were talking about women's problems this morning, and here's a book that's published in Zimbabwe by a women's group, and they're going to have a whole series of these kinds of things. They've got about, there's about 20 chapters in here. And the topics they cover are things that they want to speak to women about and have them begin to think about and see what they can do about to change their lives. Housework, childcare, water, wood, money, food prices, farming, selling, education, work, women's place in society, etc., etc. And their basic technique is to present some sort of small skit and then get the women talking with some guide questions about this. And then they have some ideas in the back, in the appendix, about what women can do, what services they can use in the government, and who they can go to or what they could do to change this situation. Now, here's one here. The woman asks her husband if she can get a part-time job on the cotton farm. He refuses. He says a woman's job is to look after her family, her home, and her fields, as Zimbabwean women have always done. He is against these modern cheeky women who want to do things away from home. He says he is earning enough for the family, and she must continue to look after the family and her fields. Okay, so then here are some discussion questions. What did you see happening in this play? Why did he allow his wife to work? Are there some women in your area refuse permission to work or do things outside the home? What does your tradition say about a woman's place in society? Is this tradition still acceptable to modern women in the 1980s? Is it fair for men to refuse their wives a chance to work? How can we together help women to do more things outside of the home? In the back, in some of the guidelines, I don't know what it says for this chapter, but it says we can change tradition by bringing up our children differently. as a group approaching the organizations our husbands belong to that preach equality. We may have people approaching the Baha'i faith saying, talk to these husbands. Or by changing laws. E.g., in Portugal, there is a law which says that husband and wife are both free to work or join groups without the permission of the other. Here's another example in this. Here's a thing about widows. I won't read the whole story, but the woman's, all of her possessions are being taken away by her husband's family because she is not considered able to hold property, and so as soon as her husband has died, her husband's family has come in, taken all the possessions, and she's left destitute. And then they talk about some questions to discuss, and they talk about inheritance laws of a customary marriage or of a civil and church marriage to educate the person. And then they also suggest in the back on Chapter 15 to learn about the new laws, and that also that your group can organize a campaign to get your husband to make a will so that you will be left the property and it will be stated in the legal will. So in other words, they're beginning to talk to women, get them to think about these things, because very often, and as an anthropologist, going out into places when we approach women about these things, they'd say, we never think about these things, or we never think about what we can do, because this is a tradition and a custom, and we don't know how to change these kinds of things. There hasn't been a lot of confidence that's been built into a lot of the women, and so they feel kind of helpless about changing all of these kinds of conditions. This is a kind of book that will give them more confidence in learning that they can deal step by step with these problems, even, you see, if it's just in educating their children for the next generation, which is a real important kind of thing. That, change may not come instantaneously. They may not find their husbands changing completely by next week, but at least they know that they can make a difference in the next generation. A little booklet on family financial planning and managing money wisely, couched in very simple terms, but which groups could take and study. Quite a thick book on nutrition for developing countries, but with lots of ideas about how to present this to people with felt posters and different kinds of demonstrations about nutrition, about the various merits of breastfeeding, and the problems with bottle feeding and the expense of bottle feeding and non-sterilization, so that people become very involved in learning something about nutritional standards. There are groups like Moral Rearmament. I don't know if you know Moral Rearmament in the United States. They're all over the world, but they're already into Zimbabwe and Africa. Which Way Zimbabwe? There's a little booklet, the same one called Which Way Africa, in which they talk about what's Zimbabwe's future, and that we want to be careful now that we've thrown off the colonial yoke, that we don't get involved into some of the same vices of materialism and sex and some of the problems which led groups astray. And then here are the 4 standards that they put up for the new age: absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, absolute love. And lots of cute illustrations, and it's a very inexpensive book which people are buying in these bookstores. Moral Rearmament, MRA, yeah. Moral Rearmament. Oh gosh, it's all over the world. I think its world headquarters is in Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know. No, they have centers all over. On a little bit different kind of level, there's a journal called Social Change and Development, which speaks to probably a more literate audience about different kinds of problems, and each issue is devoted to a different topic: education, health, the economy, and whatever. This was an interesting article here: tourism, the road to development, ? A lot of times countries will want to build up their tourist industry, but this one points out the pros and cons of the tourist industry. What are the tourists going to want? Imported French wine, cheese from another country. Where's our money going to be really going? Who's going to come and build the hotel, Holiday Inns, and the money's all going to go to America, and so on and so forth. There's a couple of cute cartoons down here. One is 1903 with these Victorian-type missionaries coming to the Africans, and they say, cover up. And here, 1983, the Africans are all now very fully dressed, standing in front of their house, and they're saying to the tourists, cover up. I wish I could go on and talk about this. This is a new booklet published by the counselors in Africa called A New Kind of People. And it draws together a lot of quotations about the distinctive characteristics of Baha'i community life and some laws concerning Baha'is, some Baha'i characteristics, living the Baha'i life, and our role in the Baha'i community. It's a wonderful set of quotations, and somebody can really have a field day taking this and bringing it down to the level of community involvement, like these books right here, so that people could really understand the application to their own life individually, rather than just having the set of quotations. Because, as you know, it takes some thought and study for each one of us to try to get a quotation and grasp what the idea is, the nugget is, and then how we can apply it to our own life. And the more we can kind of have workshops and groups like this and discuss what does this mean in our own life, why the faster we'll be able to catch some of the ideas and begin to apply that. So this would be a wonderful compilation for someone to take and to work into a development booklet similar to the ones I've been showing you. Since Betty talked about women in development this morning, I'm not going to talk about that because there's not just enough time left. I'm going to skip and go on to a few of the development projects that we noticed when we were in Africa. When I was at the Auxiliary Board Conference, the Auxiliary Board members were asked to tell about some of the things that were happening in their countries, and so these are a few of the things that they mentioned. In Bophuthatswana, a Baha'i center was built, and they put in the borehole or the well very close to a nearby village, so this village could also have use of this water. So they did this as a community project, thinking about the village and the fact that water is very scarce there, and often people have to walk long distances for water each day, and they felt that they could provide this service to the village. Also, for those of you who know the map, Bophuthatswana is divided into lots of little scattered pieces, and at this point in time, the South African government is trying to buy up some of the intervening land, which belongs to white South African farmers, so that they can turn it over to Bophuthatswana and unify 7 of its larger pieces. And at this point, they may have a lot of very inexpensive or free land, which the Baha'is have their eye on and would like to get to establish a farm, which will help support the Baha'i funds and some of the new social and economic development projects that they have in mind. So we'll keep our fingers crossed, say a few prayers for the Baha'is in Bophuthatswana that they get some of this land that's going to be bought up in the next few months. Malawi already has this kind of farm, some sort of agricultural farm, and I think it grows mostly vegetables, and it adds a lot to the Baha'i funds in Malawi. It's all done by Malawian believers. Zambia has been trying to hold institutes to help people in their training in agriculture and to learn about self-help schemes, cooperatives, and they now have 4 tutorial schools going also to help students out in the rural area. Swaziland now has 3 nursery schools or preschools started. These are started on a commercial basis so that the students, the small students that come, pay a certain amount each month, so they're self-supporting schools. But there are not very many of these preschools in Swaziland at this point, and so these are some of the first ones that have been started. They're also training local teachers to work in these schools. In Zimbabwe, of course, we know that there's been a lot of drought areas in Africa this last year. In Zimbabwe, during the drought, the government appealed for private groups and church groups to give some sort of aid, some relief to the people who were starving or hungry in the rural areas. And the response of the Baha'is was to collect quite a lot of money and buy the sacks of maize meal or mealie meal and present them to the Minister of Rural Development. And when they did this, the whole thing was televised. It was done on television, and the Baha'is were pointed out as responding to the government's call. Actually, at the same time, one of the other churches presented a check, which was for a larger amount than the Baha'is. But the Baha'is looked so impressive because they had all the bags of maize meal stacked right there. You know, it's much more impressive to have big truckloads of maize meal stacked up in sacks than it is to have a small paper check presented to you. And so the Baha'is got quite a lot of publicity out of that. Another thing that's really been called for in many African countries is the planting of trees, because there weren't very good conservation methods used all during the colonial period, and a lot of the areas have been very denuded of trees. This has resulted in a lot of erosion. It's also resulted in lack of firewood and shade and a lot of the things that trees can provide. So the Zimbabwean Baha'is have had tree planting projects, and this last, I believe it was last December, they had quite a large tree planting project where they went to different schools and planted trees. They also have now a little mobile unit, a little trailer that they're going to use for audiovisual materials to take around out in the rural area. But they also envisage this as something that they can use to help teach about health and sanitation and other kinds of social and economic development lessons, too, at the same time. And indeed, they have had institutes for women. They have a lovely new institute about 20 minutes or so outside of Harare, an old home which was, actually I shouldn't say old, but it was started by someone else and then sold. It's kind of almost a Moorish looking mansion, or Spanish looking mansion with nice big white arches. A very large structure with several big rooms, and they were able to buy it from this person at a very inexpensive price and are finishing it off. And they've had a lot of institutes there, many for women, and when the women have come, they have not only given them the Baha'i teachings, but also lessons on health, family planning, nutrition. They're very fortunate in Zimbabwe in having many pioneers who are in the health field themselves, trained doctors or optometrists or nurses, and so these Baha'is can give their services and come to these institutes and instruct the women. Interesting incident happened. On the first institute that they had for women, 2 women came in from one rural area, and one lady thought she would have a baby in about a month, and she had one the night of the institute. The institute is named Kristen Bank. That's the name of the area that it's in, so she named the baby Christina for was born there. Also, there are individual volunteers who are assisting in literacy programs there. So those are just a few of the projects that are going on, and those are mostly planned by the National Spiritual Assemblies at this point, because that's, of course, the strongest body in the country. And then they're going out and beginning to work with local spiritual assemblies, and the auxiliary board members are all committed to looking for the strongest local communities and trying to figure out what they can do along these same lines. I want to close by reading a couple of paragraphs from a very beautiful talk given by Ali Naqshbandi entitled Our Spiritual Growth at the World Center. He gave this to the entire center staff on the 25th of November in 1983. But there are a few paragraphs here about service, and I thought they just fitted in very nicely with what we've been talking about this afternoon and this evening about our individual commitment to service. Growth presupposes some living organism, a living entity. What is this living entity we are talking about here? It is the soul within us, a soul which would be likened to a seed. In one of his letters, Shoghi Effendi likens the soul to a seed and the effect of the Holy Spirit to the quickening of the seed. The seed comes in touch with the Holy Spirit, emanating from the manifestation of God. Therefore, it is quickened. So we acquire faith. So instead of having just a human soul, we also have the spirit of faith. But this faith is not enough. It has to be strengthened. It has to be deepened. It needs deeds, obedience, otherwise it will not grow. In one of his tablets, Abdul-Baha says that faith should be transformed, transmuted into certitude. Faith is a stage towards certitude. We have a whole book of certitude, but certitude and faith, again, alone are not enough. We need action. We need deeds. We need sacrifice, so that these together would be acceptable in His sight. I'll read you this passage from Abdu'l-Bahá. Know that nothing will benefit thee in this life save supplication and invocation unto God, service in His vineyard, and with a heart full of love to be in constant servitude unto Him. Notice here that prayer, service, and servitude are mentioned together. And then he goes into an explanation of the roots of all of these words being the same root. So you see this whole idea of service, servitude, work, and worship are interrelated, even linguistically. Spiritually, of course, they are, but linguistically, they are too. So here Abdu'l-Bahá says the same thing. He links all of these things together: worship, service, and servitude. And he says that nothing will benefit thee in this life save supplication and invocation, which is worship, and service in His vineyard, and with a heart full of love to be in constant servitude unto Him. Now we all know that he, Abdu'l-Bahá, is our exemplar. But what does he say about himself? My station is the station of servitude. A servitude which is complete, pure and real, firmly established, enduring, obvious, explicitly revealed, and the subject to no interpretation whatsoever. Thraldom to the blessed perfection is my glorious and refulgent diadem, and servitude to all, the human race, my perpetual religion. Now, when you are engaged in an act of worship or in an act of service, I can assure you the service itself, or maybe the worship itself, in itself, is not important. But the way it is done is important. Look at this from the Bab. Worship thou God in such wise that if thy worship lead thee to the fire, no alteration in thine adoration would be produced. And so likewise, if thy recompense should be paradise. Thus and thus alone should be the worship which benefiteth the one true God. In other words, when we serve, when we pray, whatever we do, if it is for reward or punishment, fear from punishment, or a desire to receive some reward, even if it is from God, according to the Bab, that's not really the desirable thing to do, the absolute meritorious thing to do. Yes, reward and punishment, Baha'u'llah says, are necessary instruments, pillars, he says, for the organization of the world, for the tranquility of men. They are sources of life, he says. But when it comes to rendering an act of service or an act of worship, should it be with this in mind, that I am praying so that I will go to heaven, or that I am praying so that I will not go to hell? This is what the Bab is saying. Don't do it with that motive. The motive is important. The motive should be worship for its own sake. Worship for the sake of His beauty. Worship for the sake of the love of God. I'll tell you a little story. I'll tell you a little story about Janabi Samandari. Some of us may have heard this story from him. He said that when he was young, his father sent him from Qazvin, where they were, to Rasht, where they had a branch of their office. He says, I went there and I found there was a secretary who was also an accountant, and there was also a servant in that office. He, Samandari, as the representative of the owner and the manager, was to be there too. He said that one day the servant was ill, so he went to the office and he saw that the floor had to be swept. He told the secretary, would you please sweep the floor? The secretary thought, he said, your father employed me as a secretary, as an accountant, not as a servant. Samandari said, I told him, fine, you are right. He said, the next morning very early, I went myself before the secretary had arrived, and I swept the floor. As I was sweeping the floor, I said to myself, why is it I'm happy doing this, but my secretary here is not able or not willing to do it. What is the reason? I came to the conclusion that the reason is that I consider this office to be mine, whereas he doesn't think of it as that way. Because when I am here, I don't want any recompense. I don't want any salary. This place belongs to me. But he works for a salary. He works for some reward. So he has a position, and he is not ready to do anything else but that. And then he said, I thought to myself, maybe the Baha'is are like that. Maybe there are those who consider the cause as their own, and they are ready to do any service. And there are those who consider the cause not quite their own, and they are there, and they have been told to do something, and they do it because they want to be in this cause, and they are getting some benefits from it, spiritually or otherwise, but they don't really consider it as their own. So you see, this is it. There are two types of thinking about relationship in the cause. There are those who serve for the sake of the cause, and there are those who serve for some form of recompense. There are those who serve because they want themselves for the cause, and there are those who serve maybe because they want the cause for themselves. Thank you.